Oh my god, it's season 7 of United Rogue Overwatch, which means it's time for another podcast. Welcome to Overcast. What is up, ladies and gentlemen? We are back for United Rogue Season 7. I am your host and your community manager, DatSoupCan/Ajax, and today we are going to be talking about the preseason. Now, I'm going to say this with everybody fully knowing that we had 2 matches on Monday. OBS kind of shit the bed, so I couldn't really record this ahead of time, as well as we had, again, 2 matches on Monday before the giant turbo update of perks came out. So I'm going to try my best not to talk about them too much, but I will be talking about how the perks might affect some of these teams and how there might be already some roster moves going on. So without further ado, let's take a look at some of our teams. Now, we are looking at 7 teams this season. So what I'm going to try and do, instead of just yap a whole lot about each team, I'm going to try to highlight some of the more star players, and I'm going to voice a couple concerns I have of the teams, and we'll try to get through it a little bit quicker, so that way I'm not just rambling for 3 hours straight, because God, nobody needs to hear my voice for that long. So we're going to head and start off with Las Vegas. Going through this roster, first person I see on there is Buns. Buns has been a great player last season on Miami. Shows he has a very strong showing in DPS, but also can flex around to the tank if need be. That is going to pair nicely with Storm, a prior teammate that he has, as well as now there is a different showing for some of the supports. We're going to have Crystal in there, but then you start to wonder what other support is going to go in there. Maybe Janitor. I am going to be honest. I've heard a couple things that maybe another player might be trying to swing in for scrims. Not going to leak that. I'll leak some other stuff later, though. But overall, looking at this roster, I think it's good. Maybe towards the top. Not entirely sure. My big questions on here are going to be how this backline works out. We've seen Crystal in the past do very well. Who Crystal gets paired with is a big question mark, as well as rotating the tanks in and out. I think that was something that Buns and Storm kind of worked well into Miami last season. But now with a couple other players in there, how they're going to be rotating, especially with some of these map bans. Storm is one to typically play the Rhine or the Zarya. So, if you are looking to counter them, taking out one of those 2 picks and counter swapping around them could have its advantages. Overall, I think this team can do well, but I think the big question mark is going to be how they're fielding this roster. So, we'll have to wait and see a little bit, but I think they can do good. It's just a matter of putting the pieces into place. So that is going to be Vegas. Going over to Maui. Maui is GM by Doge, who is playing. So when I saw that, when I heard that, I was talking to him. And so I was talking through him of, oh, this person's a good pick. This person's a good pick. And he ended up going through, getting the drafts. Looking at this roster, I feel confident they are a middle of the pack team. I see a Cake in the lineup, who Cake has been a phenomenal DPS player in the past, very consistent. Now, hopefully, has a team around him that can kind of elevate that performance a little bit. Caliho, we saw last season, do very good. A lot of the time, having some of that high support value, having a lot of the healing output you would need. Then you go to that guy who last season was on support in Pit. This season, looking to maybe get in some DPS games, maybe back on support. Then you have some newer faces in Mort and Recoil. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure of their play styles. I didn't go into the Emerald tryouts all too much, so I don't know how well they did. But when I look at this roster, having a Cake, that guy DPS duo with Doge as a tank, and Caliho with who I assume Mort is going to be their support, I feel like that's a pretty strong roster. The one thing that I kind of see as the issue would then be when map picks come up and when hero bans come up. How does this team adapt? I think hero pools are one of the things that we don't talk about too much, but they're so important. So looking at this roster, I see Cake, a very good hit scan player who can also flex into some projectiles. Doge, who has a pretty deep and pretty consistent tank pool. It's the others that I don't really know too much about. Caliho, I know, did a phenomenal job last season, but how deep is that hero pool? How can they find the value when some of their support picks might be getting banned? I think that the rest of the team around Maui is going to really be that hit or miss. And so it just is going to depend on those top three to get the value they need ahead of the fight and then proceed onward. So some highlights in here are going to be there are consistent players in here who have been here for a little bit, but then the roster and hero bans I think might be this team's downfall. So we'll have to see, especially with some of these matches coming up. I believe their first match is against Pittsburgh on Friday. So we'll have to see, because I'm not going to lie, Pittsburgh might be a little scary. But we're going to swing over to Montreal here. And Montreal has a roster. And I don't want to be mean, and I don't want to call people out, but this roster scares me. And not in the fun way. Not in the, like, season 2 Philly team, right? Where it's just stacked. This team scares me because I don't know who's playing what. I see Guna in there. Guna, phenomenal support. I see Dylan there, has been flexing around, pretty good support in the past. I know he plays a pretty decent DPS. Dead Inside, always super consistent on that DPS. Big Green, pretty good support coming in. Booger, when he puts himself in there, also a pretty strong tank with the team around him. New Deal, I don't know much about, but when I look at this, I'm assuming the lineup is clustered, because I see Guna, Stinky Dill, and Big Green on support, right? If you're looking at their highest. Dead Inside is a solo DPS, and then a Booger tank. You're missing a DPS player in that. So do you swap Dill over to DPS? Is that what you're going to run? Do you try and swap somebody else like Guna over to DPS? Do you try and swap Booger to DPS? It's just a big question mark for this team. Maybe if they can find that roster that works and find the lineup that works, they can just go in. But as of right now, I'm seeing a lot of question marks around this team. So, highlights, I'm seeing people who have been here for a little while, who have shown themselves to be consistent and have shown themselves to have very big pop-off moments. But then I just look at who's playing what and I get confused. So I think Montreal, because of that reason, might slip a little bit farther down in the rankings. We will have to see when they schedule their match. I believe it's against Nashville. I'm not entirely sure yet. We'll check the schedule in a bit. But speaking of Nashville, we are going to swing over to them. And in Nashville, we have Saucepan, who showed himself to be an elite DPS last season. Got himself the Emerald second team all-star. We have Marked Up, who again, insane DPS last season. We have Tracer, who showed themselves to be a pretty flexible player, mostly on the support, swapped over the tank when needed. We have Peach, who's new. We have Piper, who started from, I think, bronze like 3 and is now up at gold 1. I mean, the girl grinded. So I have so much faith in her. But then we have Dave as well, who again, similar started out a little lower, now grinded up to gold 1. I think the supports on this team have a good understanding of what's going on. I think the DPS going into it have a very good understanding of what's going on. Peach, I don't know how they play tank. So I think for me, that's their big, downside, their big question mark of the team. I'm just not sure what comps they're going to run. I'm not sure what entirely they're going to play. So if you look at this roster, to me, I see this being top half. The question becomes how they play with each other and how they can synergize some of their hero pools. That's where you wonder what's going to go on. So I'm going to say top half. I think the struggle is just going to be working together, finding what works. But I think this team is pretty scary, and I think that this is nothing to scoff at. Now, moving away from Nashville, we do have New York, who currently are missing a player. That is because the GM Bonaparte was trying to reach out to a player. They didn't quite respond, so they were dropped. And so now, from what I've heard, there is a sixth man in there. There is somebody hanging out, waiting in the wings for them to join up in New York. We're going to have to wait and see. I believe it's going to be maybe a support player. I'm not entirely sure. But overall, for the regular roster, Bonaparte, a massive, massive tank player. I mean, was making some great moments last season on Pitt. Has shown himself to be quite good. You have Dragon, who typically is a support player, flexing over to the DPS. That was something Miami looked at towards the end of the last season into the off season, and it was working for quite a little bit. So I think that could be something that is going to work out, especially when paired with Parasite, one of the OG DPS picks who has been here time and time again and has been one of, if not the most consistent players in Emerald. I think Parasite is an absolutely insane pickup. So this DPS duo could really excel. Now, of course, you go into the sports. We have Nikki, who I believe is the first time playing. Not quite sure who they play, what they play, etc. But we have Biscuit on the roster as well. Biscuit, known to be a very good player, has a lot of titles under their belt. Looking at right now this 5-man roster, I think the big concern is hero bans because of who the players are. Bonaparte and Pyre, very good tank. We only saw him on Sig and Ryan. So by banning one, you're going to be looking towards, chopping that hero pool that we saw in half. Then Dragon Master, similarly, we only really saw Reaper last season. Not a whole lot other. We swapped, here and there to like a Cass or a Soldier. But I think the big issue turns into these picks where if you're a team looking at what they play, looking at how their previous matches go, you can plan ahead a little bit and say, all right, well, if we're picking this map in the pool, we can ban them, right? King's Row pops up, you ban Ryan, and then Bonaparte instantly gets hindered a little bit. So I think they have good players. I'm curious to see what the 6th-person joins is going to do, as well as what happens with hero bans and how this team gets affected. So that is going to be the big question around New York, is just going to be who these heroes are going to be banned and where their kind of target focus is going to be. But I'm having a stroke. Going over to Pitt, we have a lot of people in here that just big names, right? Insanity ran Emerald last season on HitScan. I think everybody knows what happened when Insanity picked up the Widow. We have Kamani, who's shown herself to be an amazing support pickup, has won the championship in the past, got into finals last season. We have Zeke, who, again, very similar to some of these other players on other teams, grinded his butt off for the past 2 seasons to now hit some of these new peaks. And honestly, shout out Zeke for last season's playoffs. Dude was knocking out people left and right. Then you get to Beatdowns, who, again, on that Houston roster last season, very good tank player. And then you get to Asura and Nevro. These 2 players, I'm looking at Asura as going to be part of that backline with Kamani. I'm looking at Nevro to be a very solid fill flex player. And I'm looking at this Pitt roster, and I think currently, just by looking at the roster, this is a scary team. This could be a top 2 team. I think the way that Pitt has done things in the past, shout out Stan for being an insane GM, this team with the time and the scrims and the practice can really punch above their weight and punch into whatever bracket is above them, if not just being in the first bracket. So Pitt, when I look at this downfall, right, I'm highlighting a lot of things in Pitt. When I look for downfalls, I think the big thing is, from what I know personally, not a big shot caller there. Zeke, I think, has been trying to step up in that leadership role and start shot calling. I'm not quite sure who was the Houston shot caller, so, maybe Beatdowns is the one laying out the game plan, laying out the fight plan. But overall, I don't know really where in this roster that leadership position gets filled, because you have a lot of, high elo players, uh, but you have them all trying to voice at the same time. So having, one unified, hey, this is what we should look to, this is what we should kind of have going forward. I think that's going to be something that they'll have to talk about and have to figure out during their scrims. And now finally, for our Emerald rosters, we're going to look down to Vancouver, who also are currently missing a player. Icy did, in fact, drop himself or request a drop. And so when you pick up Icy, you know you're going to get the Kiri. Hero bans might make that a little harder. But when you look at what the Vancouver roster is currently, this is another situation to where it scares me a little bit, similar to Montreal. Andrew has been a dominant tank in Emerald before, went up to Ruby, has been a dominant tank up there, surrounded by some amazing players. And so now that he's back in Emerald, he can go back to that insane peak performances he's had. You then have Light, who's an insane hit scan, has done wondrous things, especially on the Widow. You have Cool, who I assume is going to be the other DPS in this roster. And then you have Salty Jinx and Chelsea in for the supports, because again, they're missing that fifth man. Right now, they have the bye week, so you don't have to worry about that roster slot too much. I'm sure Cool, as the GM, is cooking up something. But looking at this roster, based on what I just said, based on laying out what the idea of it is, Andrew on tank, Cool, Light DPS, Salty, and Chelsea as support, I see this team struggling. I see a lot of players on here with, smaller hero pools. So one ban could knock this entire roster on its side. I'm interested to see how they can bounce back from that, where, maybe Andrew gets banned from D.Va, so he'll have to swap back over to the Ramatra he's very comfortable on. Or maybe, Widow gets banned, so Light's going to have to swap over to a Cass or Soldier, or even Sojourn, especially because she is pretty strong right now. So I think this team, for now, they're a little lower in my kind of area, in my power rankings. I think they can punch up. They have the experience. It's just going to be a question of whether they can put it together. All right. So looking overall at these Emerald rosters, pretty close, I would say. A lot of teams kind of fighting for that middle to the top packs. Couple teams lower on the spectrum, but I think overall this is a good cluster of teams. Now again, we talked about 2 players getting dropped from their rosters or requesting a drop. I also know that there might be some change-ups to some other rosters. Some of the GMs have been talking about trades potentially, so these rosters might not stay fully. We've also saw that again, 2 of these teams have already played. Vegas and New York. If you haven't seen it, go back and watch the VOD. I think some of these teams can perform better than their expectations or can perform up to their expectations. It's just going to be a matter of, having the teamwork and getting the practice in so they can figure out what's best for them. But that is Emerald. So it's time to swing over to Ruby, where we've got some more teams to talk about. All right. Up first, we've got Baltimore. Baltimore makes a return. Fran was a player, but this time, Fran, aka Pingu, is the GM. Honest to God, because I was in the Ruby draft, I'm not going to lie, Fran might have sniped a couple picks for me, but that's okay. We're chilling. Because I see Identity up there, and I know that is going to be an insane tank pick. I see Mug, who recently joined, who I've heard very good things about in tryouts. I saw a couple clips here and there, and I definitely was looking at him. Then you see the rest of the roster. Clementine, I've heard very good things about. You have Arunos, who's been around for a while, and then you have Fran and Zach. And I think this roster, when you look at it, Identity tank, you have Arunos and Mug on DPS, and then Fran, Clementine. It's a strong roster, but compared to some of the other ones we're going to talk about later, it worries me a little bit. I think some of these players might try to force some picks or force some heroes that, work for one map and then don't work for others because some of these other teams can adapt. So I think, if they're able to scrim if they're able to communicate with each other and look at the other weaknesses throughout the rosters, I think this team could do great. The issue is putting in that time, putting in that effort, and then finding those critical points, those weak spots and armors for other teams, and exploiting them. Highlights for these teams: you have a very strong tank, a pretty solid DPS line, and a solid support line. But again, this worries me because I think this team could get exploited by some of these other rosters. So Baltimore, I have hopes for. I think they can punch up a little bit. I am worried for this roster. But a roster I'm not so much worried about is going to be Dallas. Dallas, Strider, another person who sniped me a couple times, has really just a insane roster. I mean, looking at it at face value, Seb and Danger both make their returns. Seb was a big shout out in, I believe, War Season 2. Insane tank gameplay, continues to play at a very high level. Danger, we've typically seen as a phenomenal hit scan throughout multiple seasons, now makes a return probably on this support. So if you thought she was good at DPS, you're going to think she's insane on the support role. And then you have a DPS duo of Johan and Strider, both of whom have shown themselves to be very prominent players. This team can be scary because Log's in the back waiting to fill in, waiting to punch in and say, you know what, we got a Lucio map, let me come in. Oh, you know what, they banned Lucio, I can play the Break, I can play the Kiri. He can flex around really well. So Dallas, to me, high up there. I think this team can do great things. And so highlighting the team a bunch, a lot of players who've been here for a while, or a lot of players who have played at the high levels. I think my issue looking at this team is just whether or not they can, play together as a team. I've heard a couple things about some of the players. Maybe just not as good as the rank says. I don't know. People just want to talk their shit, to be honest. But I look at this Dallas roster, I get a little scared personally. But we'll have to see how they do coming up this Saturday. Now, who's not playing this week, the team that gets a bye, and the team that is GM by the commissioner, is going to be Detroit. JD has snagged a very solid roster. We see the JD Blue Jay team up for the third season in a row. Love that. My favorite thing before the draft started was JD for a week straight, just going, my first pick Blue Jay, so everybody else go cry about it. And then building the team around him is going to be awesome. I mean, we see Gingerbread make a return, had a very good showing on Baltimore. We see Confessor make a return. Very good showing on Washington. One of the brighter spots before the roster kind of got nuked and rearranged. We see Veritas come back, has shown himself in previous seasons as a good player. And then you have a strong backline of Trashcan and JD, aka Darklaw. This team is very good. What I think the lowlights of this team is going to be, first off, just how they play mechanically. I believe there's a couple PlayStation, Xbox console players in there. So, that already puts most players like that at a disadvantage. We've talked about it before in the season. Most people talk about it again. I think having that could be a little scary. But I think another thing that is worrisome is just the communication, right? In this team, you have a couple of players in there who like to be the shot caller, who like to be that step up and be that voice. And then there are some that you would kind of hope and expect it to be that don't end up being that way. So I think if Detroit can figure out their roster within to say, all right, we're going to make this person the leader, figure out who the IGL is, and go on their marks and make those correct plays, I think this team could very easily be a top 3, top 4 team. Otherwise, I think they could fall a little bit in the rankings. So we'll have to see where they are. But now I get to glaze myself because I am the GM of Havana. And for those wondering, La Habana Hurricanes, UR does a thing where if the team is from another country with a different language, they'll put it in that language. So like Mexico City is whatever Mexico City is in Spanish. I never took it. And then Havana is La Habana. So if you're looking at that and you're confused, it is the Havana Hurricanes. Don't be confused. It's just hanging out. Otherwise, you look at this roster, and I see a lot of great players. Obviously, I picked them up. Choco makes a return. He's going to do great things. A new face in Pudu, who has, from what I've heard, done a lot of great things. I don't want to spoil too much, but I've heard is a very solid DPS player. Then you have the return of White Rain, who was a insane support player on Dallas, putting up crazy numbers in stats. Then you have a newcomer in Trick. Very excited to play with them. And then me and Ghost to round out that roster. I think this team can do very well. You know, we have a lot of carry potential within some of these roles, looking at the DPS and kind of looking at sort of the tank role. I think the support will be solid, but going into some of these other teams like a Dallas, or later on when we talk about Ottawa, going into that team, or even a Washington, it's going to come down to where some of the low-end picks are. Talking about myself in the support role, right? Having a high team around is going to be great. Just making sure the rest of the team does not, shout out me inting and folding over. I think this team can do great. I think they're middle to maybe high, but primarily middle of the pack right now. We're going to have to see how they play. Again, Saturday is going to be the match against Dallas, so make sure to watch out for that. Scrolling on down, we've got Louisville. Another new franchise. Havana and Louisville, both new franchises. I think Havana got a team in League of Legends. Louisville, I think this is their first team. So shout out Rico for picking the gamble. But speaking of Rico, has picked up a crazy roster. He stole Smooth again for like the third season in a row. He picked up Dyer, who has been insane last season. We saw Banger actually getting on the team for a full season so far. Last time he was picked up towards the end of Chicago's run. Performed pretty well. But then you have a return of Soup coming into Ruby. And we have a new player in Helios. I am very excited to see how this roster plays. Again, this was one of the matches that I've already played out against Washington. So I'm trying not to spoil it too much. I think in here, you have a lot of players who have been around for a little bit. A lot of players who know how to maneuver around some of these other teams. My issue is hero pools and kind of what happens throughout. I know Banger is a great ball player. I know Rico and Soup, both great Lucio players. Dyer can flex a little bit. See him primarily on the Genji. This screams to me as dive team. So with hero picks and hero bans, with the perks, you might be able to run past it. But I think this team might just get a little caught out by how other teams are now pinpointing some of, oh, well, if they're going to run dive, let's take out Lucio so they can't have that speed. Or if they're going to run dive, let's take out the ball so they can't run that. I think this team just needs to be careful about how the hero bans work and need to field the roster accordingly. So that way they're not just showing this one look each and every time. I think this team can do pretty well. It's just a matter of how that, one look obligation is going to go. But if you really wanted to talk about a team with one look, we're going to talk about Ottawa because we've got a couple players on here with quote-unquote one look. Shogun this season has said multiple times he's only going to play DPS. We're only going to see Shogun DPS. So I'm excited to see that. We have Adbon, who has been an insane player throughout multiple seasons, only playing Widow. Do I think that's going to stick? No, I think Adbon has said literally he's going to swap maybe in playoffs or anything. But you have those two specifically sticking on the DPS role, sticking on some individual characters. But you start to look at some of the other players on this roster. You have Recon, who is a very good support player when he has a good team around him, can kind of play up to that level. You have Treedut, who I actually just recently played with and is a very good player. You have Spaznik. I don't know too much about them. I didn't see them too much. And then you have the GM and the just crazy GOAT, Vanguard. Man has been insane every season he's played so far. He's now playing with multiple people, who are punching up there. Adbon and Shogun, insane players. Both of them on the DPS now. We're going to see how that gels well. So I think Ottawa, their strength, a lot of great just players and mechanics around them. And game sense specifically. But the issue is locking themselves into one or two looks. The Adbon Widow, the Shogun DPS. that might screw them over a little bit. Maybe they can roster change a little bit here and there, try to move some things around. But I think Ottawa is, just for the mechanics and game sense alone, got to be one of your top two. It's just a matter of if they get exploited or not throughout the season. But a team who is fresh off of a grand finale win is Washington. Gonna look to go back-to-back this season. They're bringing back Kieran and Liam, both of which on that awesome roster from last season. And then they made some great pickups as well. They picked up Mountain, who everybody was looking at for a tank. A really good player. They picked up JS, who makes a return after a couple seasons. An insane support player. And now you get Pineapple, who's shown himself to be a very good DPS player, getting onto this roster. When you look at this, knowing Liam at this point is going to be full of callouts. It's going to be full of, hey, micro and macro, here's what we should do. Here's what to look out for. I think in this roster, your biggest strength is the community around it. Each of these players brings in such a great vibe, such a great mechanical skill into them, and they can communicate well. The issue I see are the one-on-one matchups against other roles. Like, if I look at the DPS, Kieran and Pineapple, both amazing DPS players. But if I go put that against a, Adbon Shogun, if I put that against a Dire Smooth, if I put that against a Poodoo Choco, how do they stack up to that? How do they find those win cons when they might be at a disadvantage? I think that is going to be the biggest question mark for this Washington roster. I think they're still pretty high up there, but I think it's just a matter of, can the team communicate well enough to lift those players up? Can we form this tight cohesion to really just knock everybody else out of the water? So with that, that is going to be all of our rosters. We've got each of the rosters coming in. I'm excited to see how some of these teams play out. We've already seen 4 teams play. We've seen New York, we've seen Las Vegas, and then we've seen War, and we've seen Louisville. So since we've seen them, let's hop over and see what the schedule's looking like. Again, we see the schedule. We see the New York, Las Vegas. We see Louisville War. We're going to talk about it a little bit, or then we're going to move on because we have 4 other matches that we haven't seen yet. First up is going to be Nashville and Montreal. I think this probably going to be a blowout for Nashville. I see Montreal struggling a little bit this season. It's just a roster. It's just a roster that is looking to find an identity within themselves, looking to figure out who's going to play where, what slot is going to get filled with who. Whereas Nashville, you have a clear-cut plan of attack and a lot of players who have shown themselves to be very good players in their roles. So I think if you're Montreal, you've got to be a little nervous. I would say this is a 3-0 for Nashville. I'm going to just call it there. I think that's how I see it. Pitt, Maui should be a game. I think this one's going to be closer. I think that both of those rosters have a lot of high points. I think those rosters might have a low point or two. It's going to come down to, on Friday, which team is able to just edge out the others. Which team is able to take those 1v1s and find the picks early in the fight, find out what comps they're running so they can make the appropriate bans or swaps. And now that perks are in there, how are teams adapting to those? I think this game is probably going to be the Emerald game of the week. I think it's going to be the closest. I'm going to say it's going to be a 3-1 to Pitt. I think Maui can have a, pretty good showing in here, but I do see them struggling against the sheer firepower that is Pitt right now. So I'm a little concerned for Maui. I know a lot of those players in there can do and perform well. It's just going to be a question of how well are they going to take those fights? How well are they going to be able to work around the perks? Especially now that perks are, swapping in and out. You can change character, X, Y, Z. Game of the week is going to be Pitt Maui. I think it's going to be a 3-1 for Pitt. But then talking about the game that already happened, New York and LVT, I don't want to talk about it too much because that's what I'll talk about next week in the Week 1 podcast episode. But both these teams showed up. There were, a couple players here and there that I think were not available. So it was just a 5 versus a 5. I don't think this is the final form of either team yet, so I don't really want to talk about it too much, but it was a 3-0 for New York. So we are going to, in fact, scroll on down to the Ruby. First up was Louisville, Washington. Again, I don't want to talk about it too much. We have a whole week 1 podcast. There would be no point in me talking about it now. But I do see a Washington 3-0 against Louisville. I think this is, kind of makes sense based on where these teams might fall in power rankings. But we are going to swap over to the Baltimore-Ottawa game. This is going to be a big test for both teams. This is going to be a very big, how does that Shogun Adbon DPS do into the Baltimore lineup? And this is going to be a big question of how well can Baltimore adapt to a clearly strong team. I think this one is still going to end up being a 3-0 for Ottawa. I think Baltimore is going to struggle this season. I think Ottawa is going to be one of the top 2 teams. So this is just if, the Bills played the Jets, right? You have a team that can show themselves to be kind of decent here and there with good players in the roster versus a team that is clearly just kind of stacked. I think if you're looking at this, this is a warm-up match. This is just, you're getting one of the best teams out of the way, and then you get to find out what works and what doesn't for Baltimore. So you get to use this as the warm-up. But then, of course, we have the Havana-Dallas. I think this match can go either way. I think the Dallas roster is very scary. I obviously am a little biased towards Havana because, again, I'm on it and I'm GMing it. I see this close, maybe a Dal 3-1. And not to discredit the players I picked up. I have a lot of confidence in all of them. I just see the Dallas roster and it scares me. I don't really know how they've been performing recently, so we'll have to see what kind of goes on from there. But I would have to say the Dallas Havana has to be the game of the week because the War, Louisville was a 3-0. I think Ottawa, Baltimore's a 3-0. This one I see being the closest. So inevitably, it's probably going to be the game of the week, unfortunately. Now, I've talked about it a couple times. I've mentioned it a couple times. I think it's time to go into some power rankings. And now with power rankings, I talked to Foliage a little bit. Shout out Foliage. He gave me some input on how he thinks some of the teams are going to go. I went in and showed him mine. We have a couple opinions that are going to be, a little different. But I think overall there were a couple of things that we both saw that just made sense. And so taking a look at the power rankings, these are mine. Foliage had his advice. This is just mine. I am looking at these rosters. Here we are. I see Montreal and Baltimore at the bottom. I like those rosters, but I think this is just a big... You build a roster, look at everybody else around you, and just think, oh, this might not be fun. Both of these rosters remind me of some of their, mirrors last season. Baltimore was lower end of things last season. I think they're going to stay there, unfortunately. Montreal, I think, might become the new Detroit this season, down in Emerald. But then stepping above up, I think Vancouver and Louisville. Vancouver specifically, I think there's just a lot of players who only play 1 to 2 characters. And I think that team can get exploited really easily. It's going to be a heavy carry performance for some of the players on that roster in order to, climb up or, hopefully not down. And then in Louisville, they were playing one of the better teams in my opinion. Hopefully they have a better showing. But I think right now they're both kind of in that 6th place. Up next would be Vegas and Detroit. Vegas, again, just a roster confusion of what's happening, who's playing what, and where roles are defined. Then you have Detroit. I'm going to be honest. I've heard some things from JD. I think that team can do well. Right now, they might not be putting the pieces together, so it's a good thing they have an off week. Let's be real. But 4th place, I think, is Maui and Havana. These, remember, are going to be the teams 4th and up that make it into playoffs. I see both of these teams exactly the same in their respective leagues. Just very middle of the pack, very solid players, a couple question marks here and there. It's a matter of how well can those lower ranked players play with the team, play against some of those harder scaled oppositions and rosters that they have to worry about. So I think fourth place, both these teams squeak into playoffs. Do they end up taking it all? Maybe, maybe not. Third place is going to be Nashville and Washington. Both of these teams really feel like they can put it together and have strong showings. Maybe just one or two questions in some 1v1 matchups. A DPS versus DPS. Support wins out of support. You're not right sure. I think these are easily some top 3 teams. The issue becomes, can they beat those top 2? Which right now, number 2 is going to be Ottawa, New York. New York we've seen play already, but again, I don't want to talk about it too much, so I'm just going to say that roster looks scary. They're looking to pick up a 6th member who is going to round out that roster a little bit more as well. And Ottawa has just so much talent on that roster. I think the reason Ottawa is not at first is because I said so. You could easily put them in first, and I'd be fine with it. I think personally I'm putting them in second just because we continue to see this Widow only or DPS only from Adbon Shogun. If they start flexing around, then that is clearly going to be a different story. But up top, I'm putting Pitt and Dallas. These rosters scare me if I'm in either league. I think this is full of players who know what they're doing, who have a lot of, kind of backing between them, who can very easily run a lobby. It's just, can they do it? Will they do it? I think both these teams have easily shown themselves in prior seasons for player to player to just be very good. Can they put it all together and run it down is going to be the question. Now, that is going to be it for the power rankings. We have talked about our fun little, rosters and schedules. Last thing I want to mention is going to be the perks. Perks are going to be introduced, so keep in mind as you guys are going through. For those who haven't played ranked yet, Control is the only game mode between rounds you get to keep your perks. After your attack or defense, once you swap back over, boom, no perks. You're going to start back at square one unless you're in overtime. So maybe that's a time to swap things up. You get full level 3 perks and everything. I am excited. I know a lot of people have question marks around perks. I think this is going to be a good addition to them. I think Overwatch, kind of stepped up and shown themselves to say, hey, we're still here. We're still paying attention. These perks are going to make and break some rosters. So I think it is going to be let's see how it goes for some of these guys. But I think that is also going to be it for us here. Thank you, everybody, for signing up and for playing and for sticking around. It means a lot to us here at Overwatch for United Rogue that you guys continue to show up and continue to support and continue to just play the game. Speaking of support, there are the new support feature. I'm going to be honest, I don't know what it's called right now. But you can go in and show your support for United Rogue as a whole by going in for the subscriptions. They've got a couple different options to where you can get specific chats, specific commands. You can do, call outs on streams. Couple neat options. So if you have some extra little cash and or want some of the neat little funny things, go ahead, check those out. Otherwise, that is gonna be it for me. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I will see you all next time.